Okay, the topic today is the crucifixion and his victorious mindset. And today we're going to mainly cover a period of time between the arrest of Jesus through his crucifixion. All the events are true and the characters are real. So there's more written about this final few days of Jesus' life than any other period in his life. And it was a few days and hours before the extreme, or it was a few days and hours filled with extreme torture, incredible fear, massive manipulation, escalating lies and hatred. But there were also epic levels of bravery and love. Now, just as the prophets had predicted for many thousands of years, this intense and deadly time will end in utter and total eternal deliverance for both the Christ and for us. And the world's never going to be the same after this time period. And because of his victorious mindset leading up to and during the crucifixion, our lives will never be the same. Now, the story before the story. As Judean families were on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem to take part in the Feast of the Passover, they typically sang a set of 15 songs. And each refrain addressed a specific human problem and how God ultimately delivered them. And these songs would describe the punishment the Messiah would endure and also how God rescued him. And these tunes were called the Songs of Degrees, or the Songs of Steps, and they were Psalm 120 through Psalm 134. And one of these psalms, Psalm 129, is a well-known prophecy about how the Christ had been harassed his entire life for what he believed, what he stood for. And the psalm also states that he will prevail. The song expresses a graphic example that needs little explanation, a vivid mind picture of a man's skin flayed open like a plowed field. It has a bit more kick than Jesus Loves Me being sung in Mom's minivan on the way to Easter Sunday service. So Psalm 129, 1 through 4, we're going to read, and it's a song for those journeying to worship. Verse 1, "This is not the first time my enemies assaulted me. They have often attacked me since I was young. So let Israel now proclaim, this is not the first time my enemies assaulted me. They have attacked me since I was young, and yet they have not been able to overpower me. The plowers plowed over me. They plowed their furrows deep and long down my back. The Eternal is just. He served the bindings of the wicked, so they can't hurt me anymore." It's quite a song that talks about now, or back then, and in the future. There's going to come a time where we cannot get hurt any longer. All Israel knew that the Messiah would be horrifically tortured, but that God would rescue him. And they sang about his skin being peeled off his body as they trekked to Passover in Jerusalem. It seems funny to us, but that's how God kept the Messiah in the minds of the people, especially when it came to the Passover. And many Old Testament prophecies stated that Christ's impending torture, was what it was going to be. And the Message Bible quotes Isaiah 52:14 as saying, "He didn't even look human. A ruined face, disfigured past recognition." Nobody would want a picture of what he looked like in their Bible. From the time Jesus learned to sing, Jesus knew he would someday be beat so horribly that he would no longer be recognizable as a human. His family knew it too, and they probably all sang this song together, or other songs of the degrees, each year as he and his family walked that 70 or so miles to Jerusalem for the feast. He allowed himself to go through those horrific times so we too will someday enjoy eternal deliverance. So now a lead up to the crucifixion. It was hours before the big feast and the Passover sacrifice and the meal. and people from all over the known world were in Jerusalem. The city was packed. The night was bright and there was a slight chill in the air. It was early spring. It was almost a full moon, because you all know that Passover is always done on the day of a full moon. And as Jesus and his apostles were walking up the south side of the Mount of Olives, sharing and teaching and praying, at the very same time, Judas was leading about 600 hateful Judeans up the other side, the dark side. And one of Jesus' hand-picked men had betrayed him. The pressure was mounting. Jesus knew he was walking into a time of unimaginable cruelty and torture that would end in death. And after a particularly intense prayer, Jesus literally sweated blood. Then he gathered his 11 apostles together and was immediately surrounded by this menacing mob. Judas walked up and kissed him on the head to show the temple guard which one was Jesus, the kiss of death. And the crowd was so closely packed that when Jesus acknowledged who he was and stepped a little bit forward, the front row stepped back ever so slightly, and most of the crowd fell down like dominoes. And the embarrassed temple guards got up and they grabbed Jesus, and Peter pulled out his well-used long blade fishing knife, and he severed the ear of Malchus, one of the temple guards. And Jesus immediately reached out, touches this man's ear, and he received miraculous healing. Jesus told Peter that if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. He put away his knife. And Jesus saved the apostles that night. And he needed them to keep going after his death. If this had turned into a bloody brawl, into a bloodbath, who would have carried this on? He could have ended right then. All the apostles ran away at that point, leaving Jesus alone with his captors. And Jesus had predicted that every one of his faithful friends would leave him. That prediction came true. And this murderous mob began to escort Jesus down the Mount of Olives toward the entry of Jerusalem where the temple was located. It was only a few hundred yards away. And a young man, a friend of Jesus who had not been invited to the Last Supper, who had not been invited to this final mentoring session with Jesus, must have heard something was going down. So he left his house quickly for a look-see, and he didn't even fully dress himself. He just wrapped himself in a cloth. And he must have known there was something going on, so he tracked down Jesus and and his captors at that point. And he walks right into the fray. And Peter also was stalking this menacing crowd, but he stays at a comfortable distance. But this young, bold man just walked right in. He waded in. And these people had murder on their minds. And in Mark 14, we're going to read 43 through 52, I from the voice. Before he had finished talking, Judas, one of the 12, approached with a large group of people, agents of the chief priests, scribes, and elders in Jerusalem, armed with swords and clubs. The signal they had arranged was a kiss. Watch to see whom I kiss. He's the one, Judas had told him. Arrest him and take him into secure custody. And as soon as they arrived, Judas stepped forward. Judas, kissing Jesus, said, "My teacher." And immediately the soldiers grabbed Jesus and took him into custody. Now one of the disciples standing close by drew his sword and swung, cutting off the ear of a slave of Caiaphas, the high priest. Jesus calling out, "Am I a thief or a bandit that you have to come armed with swords and clubs to capture me? I sat teaching in the temple every day with you. You could have taken me at any time, but you never did. Let the scriptures be fulfilled." When they saw the armed crowd take Jesus into custody, the disciples fled. And one of those following Jesus was a young man who was wearing nothing but a linen cloth. When people from the mob grabbed him, he wiggled out of their grasp and left them holding the cloth and ran naked into the night. this wealthy young man who slipped out of his expensive linen robe was more than likely public enemy number 2, Lazarus. The Judeans wanted to kill him almost as much as they wanted to kill Jesus, because just days before he had been raised from the dead after being dead for 4 days. It caused such a stir in the city. They had to stop him, and they had to stop Jesus. They wanted to destroy the evidence of Jesus' deliverance. In John 12, 9 through 11 from the Voice, word spread of Jesus' presence, and a large crowd was gathering to see Jesus and the formerly deceased Lazarus, whom he had brought back from the dead. The chief priests were secretly plotting Lazarus' murder, since because of him, many Jews were leaving their teaching and believing in Jesus. This would have been a 2-for-1 murder special had the mob actually caught Lazarus. And religion that's not based on the truth will many times result in harassing thoughts or thoughts that tend toward murder to anybody who thinks differently than them. That's religion. Now, masterful manipulation. Now the Judean religious leaders had to determine the best way to trick the Romans into doing their dirty work and crucifying Jesus within the next few hours. And they were masters of manipulation. And they first escorted Jesus to this shrewd old schemer, a high priest emeritus named Annas. And they knew that he would tell them how to manipulate the lawyers, the politicians, the people, and the Romans. This guy was very good at being bad. Now, Mark 14, verse 53. They led Jesus off to see the high priest, who had gathered a council of religious and civic leaders, scribes, chief priests, and elders to hear the evidence and to render some decision regarding Jesus. Peter followed at a safe distance, all the way into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat down with the guards to warm himself at their fire. He hoped no one would notice. Now, how scary would that have been for Peter? Don't you think the man whose ear he cut off could have recognized him? How bold would Peter have been to do that? And it's recorded that Peter denied Jesus 6 times in this courtyard in order to save his own skin so he could live and fight another day. Next, the mob took Jesus to see the current high priest, Caiaphas, who was related to Annas. And he was one who was going to have to do the official political dirty work. He was the one who had to deal directly with the Roman governor, Pilate. And when the Roman guard, it was on high alert because of the huge crowds and religious leaders, everything was at fever pitch at that time. And they knew this was going to be the perfect time to handle Pilate. The perfect time because of the confusion. And so Mark 14, verse 64 says, high priest of the council, what else do we need to hear? You have heard the blasphemy from his own lips. What do you have to say about that? The verdict was unanimous. Jesus was guilty of a capital crime. It was unanimous. So the people, the Judeans, began to humiliate him. Some even spat upon him. He was then blindfolded, and they slapped and they punched him with open palms. You see, people, they said, come on, prophet, prophesy for us. Tell us who just hit you. Then the guards took him, beating him as they did so. Now, these were the nice religious leaders and their minions who were attacking. This wasn't the Romans. They taunted him. They beat and they spit on the Messiah. They bitch slapped him. You see, and after all, they'd been planning out and anticipating this moment for months, about 12 months. The devil had been anticipating and planning this moment for thousands of years. He'd been planning it since Adam and Eve. The devil was stoked. He was hopped up. He was psyched. And the high priest knew exactly how far to go with this beating of Jesus before the Romans would react negatively. So it's time to change now. So now manipulating the Romans. Now the maddening crowd brought the freshly beaten Jesus to Pilate. He's a Roman governor. And this was to disgrace Jesus. And the religious boys probably plucked out at least part of his beard off his face. And it says that in Isaiah 50, verse 6. They pulled the hair off his face. You see, and it was against it. And the reason so, it was against the Judean law to have an unsightly beard. Isn't that crazy? That's fine. Yeah, so that's Leviticus 19:27. So remember, the Romans had occupied Israel and all the surrounding countries for over 100 years. And both sides knew how to play each other. And it was all about keeping the peace and keeping up an image at whatever expense. So now off to Herod. See, Pilate didn't want this case. He didn't want to handle a religious case. And he knew he was getting played by these Jews. He wasn't a dope. So he had to be real careful. So when he heard that Jesus was from Galilee, way up there in Galilee, that's another province, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who was in town for the celebration. Because Herod was ruler over the Galilee. Now Herod was there because the Herod family had converted to Judaism way back, many, many years before. And they didn't practice, as we'll see. So the father of this Herod Antipas was the man who wanted to kill baby Jesus or toddler Jesus and ended up killing all the little boys 2 years and under in Bethlehem. And a few years after the death of Jesus, another relative named Herod Agrippa, he killed the apostle James just to pacify the Jews. It was all for political moves, all for political gain. We know stuff like that doesn't happen anymore. And this was a bloody family. Talk about an evil bloodline. Herod Antipas was a political pawn. He was the one who just a few months before, at the request of his wife's daughter, had beheaded the cousin of Jesus, a guy named John the Baptist. So this is who Pilate sent Jesus to. Not a very good choice. Luke 23, verse 6. Pilate. Just a minute. Is this man a Galilean? And when Pilate learned that Jesus was indeed Galilean, he meant he was officially under Herod's jurisdiction. And Pilate sent him over to Herod, who was currently in Jerusalem, because he had a house there too. And Herod was fascinated to meet this Jesus, for he had heard about him for a long time, and he was hoping he might be treated to a miracle or two. Herod wanted to dress Jesus up like a clown and do some party tricks. Imagine him clapping his puffy little hands. Woohoo! Jesus is here! Jesus is here! I've been waiting for this moment! He was anticipating Jesus putting on a show for him, doing some kind of entertainment. Just a miracle or two, Jesus, please! And it's ridiculous and degrading. Did you know that Herod's, I said that before, but his family had converted to Judaism. And they're acting like this. Now Luke 23, verse 9. That's Herod, interrogated Jesus for quite a while. But Jesus remained silent, refusing to answer his questions. Meanwhile, the chief priests and religious scholars had plenty to say, angrily hurling accusations at Jesus. So Herod's there, all this mob of religious guys are there, and they're all just hammering on Jesus. Verse 11, eventually Herod and his soldiers began to insult Jesus, mocking and degrading him. They put expensive clothing on him and sent him back to Pilate. And this ended a long-standing rift between Herod and Pilate, and they became friends from that day forward. Old Annas knew exactly how to work this thing. You know, he's like a campaign manager. He knew exactly what to do to get a win. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He had it all figured out. And Herod and Pilate hated each other before this, until this time. And Herod and his men of war treated Jesus so poorly, and as well as the Jews that he allowed into that court. And they stripped Jesus, and they put a radiant or a magnificent robe on him. This isn't that purple one that comes later. This was some splendid, resplendent, incredibly beautiful robe that Herod had. And they sent him back to Pilate. And Pilate loved it. Whoa, this is so fun. We're playing dress up. Can you imagine that? And he loved the thought of the guy that they're calling the King of the Jews, you know, to wear this princely robe, this luxurious designer garment. Now, the word mock in those verses means to toy with or make sport of something. And it does have vile connotations, which I'm not going to mention here. Now, back to Pilate. Herod had sent Jesus back to Pilate. And his royal palace was just a few blocks away from where Herod's house was. John 19, verse 1. Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers twisted thorny branches together as a crown and placed it onto his brow and wrapped him in a purple cloth. Now first they took off Jesus' robe, then they put that fancy one on. Now they put this purple one on. And if you're bleeding every time that robe is removed, it's going to rip scabs back off if they formed. So it was not a fun thing. They weren't trying to redress his wounds. And they drew near to him shouting, this is the soldiers striking at Jesus, "Bow down, everyone! This is the King of the Jews!" And Pilate, now going out to the crowd, he said, "Listen, I stand in front of you with this man to make myself clear. I find this man innocent of any crimes." Then Jesus was paraded out before the people wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. They're like it'd be like a loft area where you could overlook a crowd. And there's a screaming, angry crowd down there. Now, Jesus wasn't looking pretty at this point. He had sweat, he had spit, he had blood all over him already. And the tortures hadn't even really started. Pilate, "Here is the man!" Chief priests and officers shouting, "Crucify! Crucify!" Now, is crucifixion the Judean form of capital punishment? No. What would it have been? No, okay, Romans. It was for the Romans, but stoning was a Judean way of killing people, typically. And remember, the Romans typically would let the Judeans take care of their own troubles. So watch this manipulation, because they didn't want to get their hands dirty so close to Passover. Pilate, "You take him and crucify him. I have declared him not guilty of any punishable crime." The Jews, "Our laws say that he should die because he claims to be the Son of God." Pilate was terrified to hear the Jews making their claims for his execution. So he retired to his court, the Praetorium. Pilate needed a break. Pilate to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus did not speak. Pilate, "How can you ignore me? Are you not aware that I have the authority To free you or to crucify you? Jesus, any authority you have over me comes from above, not from your political position. Because of this, the one who handed me to you is guilty of the greater sin. Pilate listened to Jesus' words. Taking them to heart, he attempted to release Jesus, but the Jews opposed him, shouting, Jews, if you release this man, you have betrayed Caesar. And anyone who claims to be a king threatens Caesar's throne. And after Pilate heard these accusations, he sent Jesus out and took his seat in a place where he rendered judgment. This place was called the Pavement, or Gabbatha in Hebrew. Now you see Pilate switch gears mentally. He didn't want to kill Jesus. His wife even told him, leave that Jesus alone. Don't touch him. Don't harm him. But once his position and his reputation was threatened, and the kingdom of Rome was threatened, he washes his hands. 14. All this occurred at the 6th hour on the day everyone prepares for Passover. Pilate to the Jews, look, here is your king. The Jews, put him away, crucify him. Pilate, you want me to crucify your king? Chief priest, we have no king but Caesar. Do you think they really felt that in their hearts? No. They hated Caesar. But this is a ploy to manipulate Pilate. Verse 16, Pilate handed him over to his soldiers, knowing that he would be crucified. Do you see the brilliant manipulation? All started by Annas. It was all set up. He knew the chess game. Pilate now had to kill Jesus Christ because of all the hundreds of people now involved. Not to mention all the people from the Roman Empire in Jerusalem at that time, plus all the governors from the other provinces, because it was a huge festival, and all the Roman soldiers they would have brought in to keep order. Everybody's going to hear what just happened. So to save his own skin and reputation, he gives up Jesus. He had to brand Jesus a traitor to Rome in order to kill him in the hands of the soldiers. Pilate caved, just like the Jewish leaders knew he was going to. Pilate hands Jesus over to his men, and they take Jesus into a common area of the palace where there was a cohort of about 600 soldiers. And they knew exactly what to do with the traitor because they'd done it before. They knew, to them, he was already a dead man, so it didn't matter what they did to him. They could torture him to an inch of his death as long as he was alive when they crucified him. They'd done this gruesome process hundreds and thousands of times. Less than 100 years before, the Romans had crucified 6,000 men on the Appian Way just south of Rome. 6,000 crucified. You ever heard of Spartacus and his rebel slave band? You know, they had been crucifying people in Israel for over 60 years. Even up in Nazareth and where Jesus was raised, they had roads. There was many people crucified. It was such a common sight. This wasn't the only time it was ever done, like most Christians think. It was common. And remember, Jesus had been sentenced to death as a traitor and a threat to the Caesar, to the emperor. And the emperor to the Romans was a god. He was a hero to one god and a threat to the other. You know, once you're tried for a capital crime, the Romans no longer consider you a human being. You were just a thing. You're nothing. And we've known cultures that thought of people who didn't look like them as nothing. And these men of war were merciless. These soldiers beat the living hell out of Jesus. Crucifixion was usually preceded by a beating with metal-tipped whip. It would be like getting whipped with barbed wire. The Message Bible simply states, like I said before, he didn't even look human. A ruined face, disfigured past recognition. They would have whipped every part of his body. You know, not only was he beat beyond recognition, they pulled his arms and legs out of their sockets. And that's prophesied too. Doesn't say it in the Gospels. And the Romans, it was very common, if you just do any research on torture, before a slave was crucified, they would put him on a rack and pull his arms and legs out of their joints. And remember, Jesus was sold by Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a dead slave. Now you know why he couldn't carry that cross or that post. He couldn't even walk. You know, Psalm 22 from the Voice, it said, "My life is poured out like water. All my bones have slipped out of joint." The Message Bible says, "Every joint in my body has been pulled apart." What does that feel like? Remember the rack? You see in medieval times where they would stretch them apart? That's what the Romans did that way back then. It's craziness. Now you see why he had to be dragged to Golgotha. He couldn't even lift his arms up. Now on to the crucifixion. After he'd been thoroughly beaten and pulled limb from limb, they take him out of the praetorium and walk past a pile of well-used posts or crosses or whatever you want to picture in your mind. I don't care. The Romans crucified people on all kinds of things, on boards, on trees, on crosses, on X's, on posts. The easiest would be just a trunk of a tree without the limbs on it that they could plop into a hole. And they had these pre-dug holes at predetermined areas, and so they had to have a post that would fit in there. Then they'd stick rocks in to hold that thing upright. They crucified people all the time. So they reused stuff. You have to remember, they would have used the easiest thing possible to crucify people on. And this was the moment the devil had dreamed of and planned for since he quit God's team and got ejected from the real game. The game that you guys are in. A game of real life. Walking by the Spirit, walking with truth, walking with love. He tried to kill the Christ even before he was born. Think flood. Think about when they went into Egypt. You know, when they were starving, when they left. I mean, he could have killed the Christ line so many times. He tried to kill him as a child. He tried, you know, as that toddler, but he escaped. God got him out of there. He tried to kill him at the start of his ministry by throwing him over that cliff head first, but he got out of there. They tried to kill him during the temptations. Go ahead and jump, Jesus. Everybody's doing it. And there's wild animals that tempted him too, it says. I was on a jog the other day, and I went to an area I'd never been, and it's right in the foothills, and it was fun. I was having a good day, feeling good, so I took off on this little tiny path. Well, it turned out to be a deer path, and then that deer path started going places that I was having trouble going. It just went right up the hill, so I thought, well, I'm going to have fun. So, you know, I climbed up, and then I ran down, and then it was on this real steep slope. And then all of a sudden I saw this carcass of this deer that was there that I could tell had been chewed up by a mountain lion. And That was a lot of fun, to see that, to run where nobody runs. But I told Josephine, she says, "Don't do that again." But I mean, it's some things are smart to do, some things aren't so smart, but during the temptations, he'd been tempted. They wanted to stone him once. Remember, he walked right through them. They tried to drown him a couple of times on those storm-tossed seas. One time he just walked right on the water. Other people tried to grab him. People hated him. And finally, what's happening now? It's all about to happen. You could see the devil just wringing his greasy little hands, just laughing. Ha 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 ha! I've almost won. I can all but taste the sweet smell of victory. All he had to do is one more thing. He just had to get the Christ to lose focus for 1 second. 1 second. Heck, I lose focus all the time. He couldn't lose focus for 1 second. If he did, he could never have been the Savior of mankind. The devil thinks, I've almost got him. I've almost got him. And he and 2 others get dragged less than a quarter mile to a close and popular spot for crucifixion. And he's stripped naked, and he speaks kind words to a few ladies as he passes by. Imagine still witnessing when your bones are you're just a bloody mess. Your lips may not even be attached anymore. You see, you're naked and you're just getting drugged, and your heels just scraped off on the cobblestone streets. And then you have the presence of mind to say what God needed, those women needed to hear. That's a focused mind. See, now, so they do this. They get to that spot, and the centurion commands the guards to nail him and the other 2 guys up and mount the post in those pre-dug holes. And then they gamble over his clothes. And 2 more bad guys are brought out a little while later, and they're also crucified. And you can hear the chink, 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 and the screams of agony. They're already in pain, but what's it like to get your hands and your feet pierced? We know that the only evidence of crucifixion they found in a grave in the 60s, and they had nailed the bones that were still there, and they still had 1 stake, and it went through the sides of the feet. They could tell that the nails, it wasn't through the toes and stuff, it went through like the ankles, and that's how they nailed it each side onto that post. So I'm sure they did it different ways. Not fun. See, now there's 5 people sentenced to death on that same spot, Jesus and 4 others. And they hang there for about 6 hours from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Jesus steals his mind. He knows that he's the final and most necessary Passover sacrifice. Now, just to revert for a second, the guy who carried his implement of torture, his cross, his stake, his post, was a guy named Simon of Cyrene. That's across the Mediterranean Sea. And now a fun fact about that area: the Romans loved people from Cyrene, because Cyrene grew a crop called silphium, and silphium was induced abortions, and so it was the day after pill, so to speak. Day after plant. It was the Romans' plant parenthood, and so that's where Simon of Cyrene was from. Doesn't really add to this teaching. It's just one more little fact there. And so they made him carry this thing. He probably was a wealthy guy. They'd get a big kick out of that, the Romans. They could care less. If you weren't Roman, they hated you. You were nothing. You were a dog. Isaiah 50, verse 5 from the Voice says, See, I guess before I say that, see, Jesus stilled his mind. And now his final set of thoughts. He's been hanging there for about 6 hours. And the clouds had rolled in. It had cooled down. The wind picked up. The crowd dissipated at some point, except for a few of the ladies that stuck around. Everybody went back to their houses or wherever they were staying because it was time for Passover. At sundown, they had to, right now they were killing the Passover lambs. The temple was about to. They were preparing to kill that thing, and which Jesus, of course, was the final Passover lamb. You see, but everything happened. An earthquake happened. Imagine shaking and still being tied to that thing. Even more pain. So it was a crazy day. Crazy day. And the devil just laughing. Such fun. But this is what's going on inside Jesus' mind. Verse 7, because the Lord, the eternal helps me, I will not be disgraced. So I set my face like a rock, confident that I will not be ashamed. My hero who sets things right is near. Who would dare to challenge me? Let's stand and debate this head to head. Who would dare to accuse me? Let him come near. This is a prophecy from inside the head of Jesus at this time. Bring it on. Bring it on. With steely resolve, Jesus sings his victory song, Psalm 22, which we've taught before. Jesus keeps his victorious mindset during the worst of times. We can do the same things, folks. During the worst of times, you set your mind and nothing can break that focus. Try not to break for even a second. And moments before he dies, he says in his mind, God, my hero is right here. Devil, I'm going to take you on and take you down, buddy. We're about to tangle. Bring it on. Jump, Froggy. It's game time. His life is far from over. In fact, it's just getting started. And we too are just getting started. He did die that day, but he was raised from the dead 72 hours later. And he's still up, and he's still working to help us help ourselves. See, even during the crucifixion, Jesus kept his victorious mindset. We can too, folks. We can too. Let's maintain our conviction, and we too will surely enjoy our victory. God bless.